Hi everyone, and thanks for being with me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Brittany Higgins and the Bruce Lehrmann case because it featured primarily this particular week because it was something that we'd all been waiting for in terms of the defamation hearing being adjudicated by Justice Lee. Now, a couple of things I want to say about Justice Lee is he's quite a comedian, and we've got to admire him for his comedic ability because he did say some things that I thought were rather funny, and so it broke up what was otherwise a very tense and very well thought through presentation by the Justice.
To remark that Mr. Lehrmann is a poor witness is an exercise in understatement, but irrespective of legal obligation, there are gradations of seriousness of untruths. An untruthful person may just be all mouth and trousers, or may be recklessly indifferent to the truth. All these falsehoods, together with his Walter Mitty-like imaginings in skiting to Miss Gain about ACES, demonstrate that Mr. Lehrmann has no compunction about departing from the truth if he thought it was expedient. There is a significant difference between the distortions of Mr. Lehrmann and Miss Higgins. In the case of Mr. Lehrmann, the untruths were all over the shop, being a form of what might be described as disorganised lying, whereas the untruths of Miss Higgins, A, can be placed in two temporal categories, B, were in the latter category quite organised, and C, within both categories generally had a common thread. Declaiming on the topics of who was building submarines and where they were being built is not quite the repartee one would usually expect to hear over a convivial drink on a Friday night between 20-year-olds out for a good time, even if, with respect, one would not expect the badinage of the Algonquin Round Table and that some attending were political junkies who had an interest in defence matters. This is far from a picayune point. One does not passively. Intuitively, given what had been happening, one would think it likely the drinking continued, given what we know about Mr. Lehrmann encouraging Miss Higgins to imbibe and the rationale given by him for them to come back to the suite. After all, Mr. Lehrmann said he was going to show Miss Higgins whiskey, not Qing Dynasty ceramics. Mr. Lehrmann's state of mind was such that he was indifferent to Miss Higgins' consent and just went ahead willy-nilly. Having escaped the lion's den, Mr. Lehrmann made the mistake of coming back for his hat.
And it did bring about some really interesting issues, and I guess the most important one to me is that there is nobody who has been involved in this case who gets off scot-free. From Wilkinson right through to Lehrmann himself and Brittany Higgins, I guess, as well. So what this means is that if you have been a Ben Roberts-Smith or a Senator Reynolds, I suggest that Ben Roberts-Smith does not challenge the decision made against him any further, and that Reynolds chooses not to go ahead with her own defamation case against Higgins, because the outcome for anybody who decides to challenge the integrity of another person may find that their own integrity is challenged as well, which was clearly the case in the Ben Roberts-Smith case, and particularly in relation to the case that Lehrmann took against Channel 10. So what does all of this mean? Well, at the end of the day, the man is convicted in on the balance of probability, at least in a civil case, of being a rapist. And as the ABC puts it in this article, the federal court has found on the balance of probabilities Bruce Lehrmann raped Brittany Higgins at Parliament House in 2019. On Monday, Justice Lee delivered his judgment in Mr. Lehrmann's defamation case against Network 10 and journalist Lisa Wilkinson, finding the pair had sex in the office of Senator Linda Reynolds, that Miss Higgins did not consent, and that Mr. Lehrmann was indifferent to whether she had consented. And it was an interesting decision because in this particular case, he was able to draw some conclusions about what it was specifically like for women. And I thought this was interesting given that he's a 60-year-old, I guess. I don't know the exact age of Justice Lee, but he was able to, in this instance, understand what it was like for a woman who had been raped and how there must have been some cognitive dissonance in terms of her experiences and how she could best articulate them. And he seemed to have an understanding, which I think if you watch that particular part of his presentation, you will notice that he is extremely considered in relation to what those experiences must have been like for her. And from that was able to draw some conclusions about the way she talked about it, the way she interpreted it, and the fact that she perhaps was not as consistent as what she may have been had she not gone through that and had a different experience. So I thought it was a fabulous outcome, and that I just need to note that there are lots of people who are going to feel the brunt of this type of decision. Now, we also need to be aware that there are allegations against Lehrmann on 2 other occasions in Toowoomba, which will be heard, I think, in June or July, and we need to sit back and wait and see. But I also think we need to understand that at least women can be understood when they experience rape, and that there are magistrates who will listen to their story and who will draw conclusions. Of course, before a jury, though, of their peers, there might be a different outcome, given that this is one person's story versus another. But certainly on the balance of probabilities, the man's a rapist. End of story. That's all we probably need to know. But the other thing too is, what does this mean for Lehrmann? Well, the costs involved are immense, and I've got some details here. For Wilkinson, for example, the challenge was lodged last year in New South Wales Supreme Court. Documents revealed the cost was already above $700,000 for her. That was well before the defamation trial, which ran for more than 5 weeks. So, in other words, it's going to be in its millions. No dispute about that. When Justice Lee heard the case, he found Ms Wilkinson was entitled to her own lawyers in the case, and her employer, Network 10, would have to pay reasonable costs. When the costs hearing starts next week, one of the issues to be resolved will be the quantum of those reasonable costs, with the court already foreshadowing that a mediator may be required to assess the scale of those costs. It appears what sort of cost Network 10 will be chasing to pay several senior lawyers, including Barrister Matthew Collins, who led their case. The cost to 10 would be very, very significant, some people say. Mr Bartlett, representing Nine Entertainment, in their defence of the Ben Robert Smith claim, which went to 110 days and cost some $30 million. So senior counsel are now charging probably a minimum of about $12,000 a day. All I can say about that is, clearly, I've been in the wrong profession. Should have done my law degree, could have made a fortune, particularly when it comes to defamation cases and in court cases in general, I guess. So the costs are immense. Now, the issue that I want to raise in relation to this Ben Lehrmann Higgins thing is that we all seem to have divided into tribes. So there's a group of people, for reasons I do not understand, who want to support Bruce Lehrmann. And of course, 7 Network is part of that. And I guess on the other side, if you want to look at the networks, then there's 10 who are supporting Brittany Higgins. But the reality is that there's a whole group of people who support Lehrmann's claim, I guess, that he didn't commit this particular act. And I do wonder, why it is that people would want to support a person who is allegedly committed such a heinous crime as raping a woman. But there are people that do. And there's a really interesting take on this on the ABC website that I thought is at least worthwhile reflecting on. Meanwhile, tribes established themselves around each of the 2 human beings who were alone in that suite that night. The woman who says she woke up from a drunken stupor to find the man having sex with her, uninvited, and the man who says nothing of the kind happened after they entered the suite together and perhaps drank whiskey or perhaps not, after which he collected some papers and then left without bidding her farewell. Now, Team Women, fueled by accumulating rage at everything ranging from women not being believed through Christian Holgate getting sacked to a general exhausted fury about the shit women have to put up with at work, showed up in droves, and that's certainly the other side. Now, Team Man, meanwhile, gathered under the rule of law banner, genuinely perturbed that an allegation that should properly be dealt with by the justice system was being prosecuted instead by journalists and by angry women in the street. Over the years, both tribes broke their own rules from time to time. To believe her team in its passion to defend a young woman brave enough to speak up was too hasty also to embrace the ancillary tale that of a calculated political conspiracy to silence Higgins, and that's true. In the process, ironically, another woman was disbelieved and shamed, namely the political staff of Fiona Brown, who history will record as having behaved, if not perfectly, then at least with courage and decency in a shocking situation. And Fiona Brown actually came across pretty well throughout this case, and we need to acknowledge the significant contribution she made in order to be able to tell her experiences of actually what happened, particularly with regard to Reynolds. So there you have it. There are these two sides. Now, the question I'm going to ask you today is, which side are you on? Be honest. Tell us whether you think that this either did not occur or did not occur in the way that Higgins had interpreted it. Keep in mind, though, that Higgins did not necessarily want to go to the police in relation to this issue. I'm sure there were people behind her pushing her to do this because there was some political implications in relation to the fact that it happened in Parliament House and it happened in Reynolds' office. So, there were lots of influences, I think, on both parties in order to carry this forward. But there again, when you look at Bruce Lehrmann, you've got to kind of wonder what sort of a person who had left, what sort of a person is he that would leave a woman drunk, stranded in a government office, while he's off looking at something else, something to do with AUKUS or whatever, and then just doesn't check on her to find out about her well-being, and then leaves. That's not the indication that this is a decent human being, because I'm sure it's something that most of us would not do, that we would be more careful, more attentive to someone who is clearly intoxicated, but not Bruce Lehrmann. I personally think he's a despicable human being and the worst of mankind, the reference being man, and that there are many lessons for all of us to learn from these experiences. Number one, be respectful. Number two, let's be honest. And number three, don't try and take. Now, for lots of young men, if your intention is to intoxicate somebody, then with the purpose of having sex with them, then you are going down a slippery slope. It's abhorrent to think that men would either intoxicate or drug, which is the same thing in a way, but so that they can become more influenced about a sexual encounter, or at least not even know that they're having sex because they're too intoxicated, they've either passed out, or they are just not able to comprehend what's happening. And particularly during that time when that man's having that sexual act, they are incoherent. They're unable to say no anyway. And even if they did say no, would that stop the man from committing the act? Probably not. So, and I think that was a key part of Lee's decision, was that he was able to understand that Bruce Lehrmann had created an event through providing all these drinks for Brittany Higgins, that his intent was quite clear. And the point I want to make is that there are many men out there who would use this opportunity to intoxicate women and abuse them. And there's no other way of putting it. It's wrong, it's abhorrent, and it needs to stop. So if you have any comments to make in relation to Bruce Lehrmann and Brittany Higgins, please feel free to do so below. I'm sure there will be people that disagree with what I say, because there always are. So reflect on it, and reflect on your behaviour. If you're a guy, just reflect on your behaviour and how you have behaved that may have placed women in compromising positions, simply because you were too bloody horny and you just wanted to have sex. It happens a lot, happens far too much. Let me know what you think in the comment sections below. In the meantime, take care, look after yourselves, and more importantly, be safe.